We do things a little bit differently in student ministry than we do on a Sunday morning in big church. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of a taste of what it's like to be in student ministry on Sunday morning or Wednesday night. So one of the big things that we like to do is have some interaction. All right, so all of you, yeah, there you go. I love it. So all of you extroverts in the room just got really excited because you're like, we get to talk in church, yeah. And all of you introverts are like really sweaty palms right now and not really sure what to do with yourselves. And I just want you to know that it's completely fine if the person next to you needs to be your inner self, or your worship handout or journal, or just staring silently at the floor. Completely fine. Just do whatever's right for you. But we always open up with some sort of engage activity or a conversation, a question to have as we get started with our sessions each week. So I just like to ask this question. It's New Year's Day, so here's our New Year's question. What is different in your life today than it was 1 year ago? And a follow-up question to that: what would need to be different 1 year from now if you were to consider 2023 a success? All right? So what's different from 1 year ago, and what needs to be different 1 year from now? All right? Are you ready? Can we try this out? Okay, so turn to the person next to you or your inner self and answer those two questions just real quick. I'll give you about 45 seconds. I hear voices. This is amazing. I love the sound of voices as you chat together. This is amazing. Hey guys, nice to see you. All right, so let's pull it back together. All right, so that you may have been stretched a little bit, and that's completely fine. We're going to ask some questions throughout. If you need to, if you feel like you'd like to turn to the person next to you and answer those questions, that's completely fine. But I'm not going to give you as much time to really work through those as we go along, but just for the sake of time, because I don't want to be here at 3 o'clock. If that's all right with you guys, I'd like to get out of here before football starts. All right, so as a youth pastor, I don't do a whole lot of weddings, officiate weddings, but I have done a few, and I made it a pretty strong commitment early on to do some pre-marriage counseling every time I'm asked to do a wedding, and it's something Misha and I experienced, and it was a good experience for us. And one of the roles of pre-marriage counseling is to get some expectations out on the table, to say, all right, so and some of these expectations are pretty big and obvious. Are we going to have kids? How many kids are we going to have? How are we going to discipline those kids? Who's in charge of the budget? How are we going to manage our finances? What, kind of those big questions that can be landmines if we don't set our expectations from the beginning. If we don't get our expectations out on the table and make sure that we're heading in the same direction. Because that idea of marriage is bringing two lives together, two family cultures, two different people into the same family, and it can be really intense when you have two different expectations about the way things are going to go. Some of them are obvious and some of them aren't so obvious. You find yourself in a knockdown, drag-out fight, intense, and when you get back to the root of the disagreement, it's really about the disrespect or feeling unloved, about the direction of the toilet paper. Whether the toilet paper goes over the top towards the toilet, or towards the toilet as God intended, or underneath towards the toilet as everybody who's wrong does it. Okay, so these little expectations, we get them out on the table, we talk about them, and we say, okay, so how are we going to navigate this and not step on a landmine as we go into our first few years of marriage? Because that can be a really difficult thing as we're merging two lives together. But it's like this whenever we bring anybody into relationship with somebody else. We have expectations of friends, of bosses, of church people, of what the overall church is supposed to be about, and we have expectations of God. Now we've come through the Advent season and our celebration of Christmas, where some of us are still in that as we move to Epiphany here in a few days, and so one of my favorite passages to read through this time period is John chapter 1, what we call a prologue, the first 18 verses. It starts, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then a few verses later, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." And then a few verses later, in verse 11, it says something that's really unsettling to me, something that really gets me and bothers me a little bit. John 1:11, he says, "He came to His own, but His own did not receive Him." Now there's hope there, because to those who did receive Him, He gave the right to become the children of God. But there were His own who He came to did not receive Him. And this bothers me, because when Isaiah predicted that the Messiah would be a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, rejected and despised of men, he wasn't talking about pagans and the Roman government. He was talking about His own, the people who should have recognized Him for who He was. And the reason this is unsettling for me is because I'm a church kid. I've been going to church my entire life. Before I was even born, I was in church. I think I was born at church. I was in church from on Wednesday nights, Sunday mornings, Sunday nights. I mowed the lawn. I cleaned the bathrooms. I was in church all the time. And this idea that His own would not recognize Him is unsettling to me. The people who should have been looking out for Him, the people who should have been watching for the Messiah, they hadn't heard from God in 400 years from the prophecy. And then all of a sudden there's John the Baptist making some really intense prophecies and being shown to be a prophet, acting like a prophet. And then there's Jesus who's performing miracles and proving that His message is true by the miraculous things that He does. And they should have recognized Him. And I'd like to think that I would have been among the group that followed Jesus, maybe one of the apostles. But I'm a little nervous that maybe my expectations on the Messiah would have blocked me from seeing Him for who He was, and kept me from the blessing of walking and talking face to face with God Himself. I'm a little anxious about that, a little nervous about that when I think about that idea, because I think that's what caused the religious leaders to miss the Messiah. I think that the expectations that they had on the Messiah and on what He would be about and what He would do in the world, I think that that's what kept them from really leaning in into accepting Jesus for who He is. So for our time this morning, I'd like to skip through the book of John and take a look at a few stories from the book of John about people's interactions with Jesus that reveal some expectations that the religious leaders and the people of Israel had on the Messiah that maybe didn't match up with what God actually intended. And then we'll see if we can figure out how that might play out in our lives today. All right, so our first story is in John chapter 4. It's a well-known story, the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus in John chapter 4 says He had to go through Samaria to go from Judea to Galilee. That wasn't really true. There were other routes that were commonly used by good Jewish rabbis, but Jesus had an appointment. He had a divine appointment to meet with a lonely woman drawing water in the heat of the day by herself, and he had a conversation that he needed to have with her. And so he went through Samaria, and it wasn't long in their conversation where she realized that he was more than just some Jewish rabbi wandering through the territory. He reveals some things about her, and then she says in verse 19, "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet." That's a pretty pretty understatement there, isn't it? She says, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. Now where they were is a town called Sychar, which was situated in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And these mountains are really important. If you do a search through Old Testament history, you'll see the importance of these two mountains in Jewish history. So her ancestors, the Samaritans' ancestors, had set up a temple to worship Yahweh on Mount Gerizim in direct response to Jerusalem. Like they were like opposed to each other, and sometimes violently so. There was bloodshed between the Samaritans and the Israelites, and it was a really tense situation. And so the Israelites, because of you can look up the history of Samaria and Israel. That's not really the point of this message, but there was some tense relationships there, and the Samaritans were like, "You guys are wrong. You're supposed to worship God on Mount Gerizim at our temple." And the Israelites were like, "No, you're wrong. You should worship God in Jerusalem. That's the only place that you're supposed to worship God." And so the woman sees her chance. She probably points to the mountain. She says, "On this mountain, my ancestors say, this is where you're supposed to worship. But you people, you Jews, claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Who's right? Them or us?" I think our first expectation that we see here is that we want God to affirm our previously held bias. The Israelites wanted the Messiah to come into the world and say, "You're right, and everyone else in the world is wrong. And you are really the ones who should be in charge because you're right." Don't we identify with that a little bit? We get these biases, these previously held preconceptions so ingrained in our lives, in our psyche, and we say, everyone else is bad, everyone else is wrong, and I'm right, and I should be in charge of stuff. That's essentially what we want God to tell us. We want God to affirm our biases, and so the question, who's right? Them or us? And you know what Jesus' response was? Neither. Both of you are wrong. You're right a little bit, but you're wrong. You can be absolutely right in the things that you say, but if you say them in the wrong way, then you're wrong, right? That's definitely a thing that was going on there in ancient Israel at the time. And so Jesus says, neither in this place nor in Jerusalem will you worship, but God is looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth, affirming that the Messiah had come not to set up the Mosaic law and situate it as the one everybody follows, but to establish the new covenant where the Spirit of God would indwell every believer and we would be free to worship God wherever we are in spirit and in truth. Isn't that amazing? Neither are right. And sometimes I think in our lives we expect God to say, yeah, you know what, you're right. Those people are awful and you're right, and obviously the good one in this argument. But I think often Jesus wants to tell us neither of you are right, mainly because of the condition of your heart and your attitude towards that other person. So the question that I'd like for us to consider, if you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, what belief, what attitude about God, myself, or those around me would God really like to change right now? What previously held bias do we have? What thing that we're really, really confident and sure about would God like to adjust in our lives today? The second expectation comes from John chapter 5. It's another well-known story. We heard a little bit of it just a little while ago. And I think this expectation is that we want, that the Israelites and we the Israelites wanted the Messiah to follow their understanding of the rules, their definition of the way the rules should be read. All right, and in John chapter 5, you heard the story of the healing of Bethesda. And so Jesus walks along. He sees this man having not been able to walk for 38 years. And he says, you want to walk? And the guy says, of course I do, but I can't get to the water. The legend was that an angel would stir the water and the first person in would be healed. Whether that's right or wrong, it was the legend at the time. And so the man was like, I can't get into the water, so how can I be healed? And Jesus said, well, get up, pick up your mat and walk. And so he does. And so here's the relevant point. John 5:8-10. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. But the day that this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. Okay. So this incredible, miraculous thing had just happened, and they're so focused on their definition of the rules that they can't see that God is at work in their midst. Of course, they're looking at the situation and they're like, this is like number 4 on the list. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? And so how can this person be holy if he's making people work on the Sabbath? Now what's the problem with that? Their definitions were off, weren't they? They had set up their own rules. They had said, here are all of the ways that you keep the Sabbath that God had never established. There were hundreds of these rules that they had set up for how you keep the Sabbath. You can walk this far, but no further. You can pick up this thing, but not that thing. You can get your ox out of the ditch if it falls in, but you can't actually do any work with it. Right? They had set up such a defined definition of what it meant to work on the Sabbath that God hadn't actually said. He had just said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and they had set up all of these definitions. And so they expected the Messiah to follow their definition of what it meant to keep the Sabbath when they didn't realize that he was there as the Lord of the Sabbath. And he was the one who set the definition of what it meant to work on the Sabbath. Right? So I think the Messiah, God himself, probably knows what he meant when he said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So the question that the Israelites were asking, the religious leaders were asking, is how can you claim to be the Messiah yet break this most basic of rules? And Jesus' answer, you misunderstand the rule. You don't really understand what the rule is. So here's the question that I have for you, for all of us. Our question is, if I'm honest with myself, if we're honest with ourselves, what rules or liturgies, the way we do church, or the way we live about our lives, the things that are exactly right or exactly wrong, what rules or liturgies have I made into something God never intended them to be? That's a tough one for church people, isn't it? The third expectation that the Israelites, the religious leaders, had on the Messiah is that they wanted him to do the things that they wanted him to do. They wanted him to kind of do what they wanted. And here's the story is John chapter 11, another famous story, the raising of Lazarus in Bethany. His best friends in the world, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, were in Bethany, and Lazarus got sick. Jesus was like, I'll just hang out for a couple of days when he heard about it, and so he waited to go to Bethany, and in those 2 days, Lazarus died. And then he's like, okay, I'll go now. And so Jesus goes after Lazarus dies, and on his way into town, Martha hears that he's on his way, and she runs out to meet him and says, Lord, if you were here, he would not have died. They wanted him to heal Lazarus. Of course, right? Lazarus is one of his best friends in the world, and there he is, sick on his deathbed. Wouldn't he want to heal Lazarus? And so here's what Martha said in John 11:21-25. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. See, there's still that faith. Martha really does know Jesus. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if they die. So Martha's question was why didn't Jesus heal his friend? If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Why wouldn't Jesus want to heal his friend? And the answer that Jesus gives, I have much better things in mind. So sometimes it's so that the glory of God can be put on display in the lives of his friends. Sometimes it's so that we can learn a lesson. Sometimes it's just something that he allows us to go through for our personal growth and our relationship with him. But sometimes, though, don't we have some things in our lives that cause disillusionment? When they happen or don't happen, when we have some things going on in our lives that we would really like Jesus to heal in our lives, some suffering, some pain, some family distress of some sort. We have things that we really want God to do, and if he doesn't do it, or if he does something in our lives that we don't like, we're like, God, why didn't you heal your friend here? I'm your friend, right? It's in a song. I am a friend of God, right? So why won't you heal your friend? And I think that sometimes God's answer is I have much better things in mind. So our question is, if we're honest with ourselves, if I'm honest with myself, what action or inaction of God is causing me disillusionment right now? What is something I'd really like to happen that's not going my way right now? Some healing or some family distress or something that I'd really like God to move in my life, but maybe he's not right now. There's a follow-up question to this one. What do I need to do to submit my expectations to God, to live with an open hand and say, God, whatever it is that you have that is so much better than what I'm expecting, what is it that you have to give me? One of the exercises that I do with the students sometimes is it's kind of a meditation prayer kind of thing. It's called Palms Down, Palms Up. If you've ever read Richard Foster, you've read about this. But you sit with your palms down and you release your expectations, you release your burdens, you release your things in your mind, and you say, God, I give all of these things over to you. And then you sit with palms up and you ask. You imagine the gifts of God, the better things that God has for us, as if they're coming down. I don't know if you've ever seen Hunger Games, but like the little silver ringing bells coming down in the Hunger Games, coming down and resting softly in your palms, and you sit with open hands, ready to receive the better things that God has. And I think that's a better posture for us than to grasp on to our ideas of the future, our ideas of what needs to happen, and hold God to those and hold those expectations to God, because he has often so many better things for us if we can submit our expectations to his will. The fourth expectation, and I think this is one that we struggle with in an affluent society, is that we want God to build my kingdom here, right? We sing the song, "Build Your Kingdom Here," right? And we sing those words, but in our actions and in our activities, and I think in our attitudes, sometimes what we're really saying is, build my kingdom where I want it to be. The story that we're gonna look at is Jesus before Pilate in John chapter 18. The Jewish leaders can't put Jesus to death, even though they so badly want to. It's against the law, and they'll bring the Roman army against them. So they take him to the Roman governor Pilate, and Pilate puts him through some questioning and can't find any fault in him. And so as part of that conversation, we come to our passage in John chapter 18. It says, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" In a political sense is what he's asking. Jesus asked, "Is that your idea? Or did others talk to you about me?" And Pilate replied, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." You see, what Jesus was answering was this question of the religious leaders, their expectation that he would be a political leader to set up the throne of David that would reign for eternity and set Israel as a political kingdom to rule the world, one kingdom to rule them all, and draw them and bind them and be the ones in charge. And you see it even in the attitudes of the apostles. In another story, their mother comes and says, can my sons sit on your right and left hand? What they're imagining is that the Messiah comes in, kicks out the political government, and sets Israel up as the dominant government in the world. And the question is that if he's actually the Messiah, why doesn't he defeat the Romans and set up his kingdom? Why doesn't he set up a physical throne and kick the Romans out? It had happened where the Jewish people are celebrating Hanukkah, and that's a moment where the Israelites kicked the Greeks out. And so I think that they were setting that expectation for the Messiah. And the answer was, my kingdom is so much bigger than that. My kingdom is not a physical political kingdom. It's not something where I set you up as in charge of this set of people over here. I'm not setting you up as a governor or anything like that. We're setting up a spiritual kingdom that will be an eternal thing. And so I think as we imagine how we would interact with Jesus in this moment, and maybe our attitudes as we approach the next year, as we answer the question, what would need to be different in our lives if we were going to consider 2023 a success? I think most of us, actually, at least in part, say, I want to be in charge of more stuff. I want to be a little bit more financially stable. I want to have my kind of kingdom established here on earth, or even here in this church or in our neighborhood. I want to be in charge of stuff. So our question, I think, is if I'm honest with myself, am I okay if I don't get my way at work, at home, or at church? Is that something I'm okay with? If my way isn't the way that things go, am I more concerned with being in charge of stuff and getting my way than I am of submitting to the will of God and seeing his kingdom established on earth? I think that's an important question. I think that goes back to our open hand idea, is what are we actually holding God to that he's got better things in mind for us? There's an idea, cognitive dissonance. You've probably heard people talk about this. And I sometimes when people talk about it, I think, that word, you keep using that word, it doesn't mean what you think it means. But one way to think about it is when we're confronted with a truth that kind of conflicts with what we've been assuming is right.
It's what we've been assuming is true. And so we kind of have this thing in our face that we've been acting in one way, and it's revealed to us that this other way is actually the right way to go. But we kind of hold these two things at the same time because we don't want to think that we're bad people. It's a human thing. We say, well, I'm not a bad person, but I've done this thing that I now realize is bad, so it must have been right. We justify ourselves, we rationalize our behavior, and so we can say and feel good about, continuing with what we've already been doing. And it helps us hold on to our previous assumptions or behaviors. But I think that in order for us to move into a new year in a spiritually, emotionally, physically healthy way, we need to let go of some of that so that we can recognize the work of the Messiah in our lives. As we're studying, as we recognize the Messiah for who he is, maybe we need to let go of some of our expectations, some of those things that we've been holding on to so tightly. So how about answering these questions, right? And this is how we'll close this morning. What expectations are we holding on to that are hindering our relationship with Christ and his people? What expectations are we holding on to that are hindering my relationship with Jesus? Maybe causing some bitterness or some disillusionment in our lives. What expectations are we holding on to that are hindering our relationship between us and the people of the church? Maybe some things that aren't quite the way we expect them to be or want them to be, whether we've expressed that or not. What are expectations that we are holding on to that are hindering our relationship with my family? Are we setting our spouse or our kids up to fail by not telling them about these expectations and then getting really upset when our expectations aren't met? I think that maybe it's time for us to reevaluate some of the expectations that we have over people and release some of those. Because one of the tragedies of the stories in the Gospels is that the people missed out on the blessing that God had promised to Abraham. Remember that this is part of the original promise to Abraham, is that he would bring the blessing to the world through the family of Israel. And at that moment, when he was literally bringing that blessing to bear on the world, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. I think that's a tragedy. I think that's an important thing for us to recognize, especially for us who have been in church for 40 years, for 50 years, for our entire lives. Are we missing out on the blessings of following the Messiah because we're holding expectations that we don't need to hold? That's all I've got to say. So let's pray together. Let's close our eyes and enter into a spirit of prayer and imagine for a moment that we're living life the way Jesus wants us to live right now. That we have let go of inappropriate and unreasonable expectations. That we've recognized how we are forcing God into a mold that he wants to blow up in our lives. God, help us to live life the way you want us to live it. Help us to extend grace and forgiveness and to be open to these relationships with the people around us. To move into this next year submitting to your will and to understand that you have so much better for us than we can imagine for ourselves. There's some next steps that we can take together. In the back of the pews, there's a card online. If you're worshiping with us online, you can fill that out. And maybe you're here and you're just getting to know Jesus, and you want to know how to follow him a little better, or you want to get linked up with someone who can help you understand what this thing is all about. Or maybe that you're right now in conflict with somebody because of some unmet expectations, whether you've actually told them about those expectations or not. You need to repair that relationship this morning. Now's a good time to do that. Now's the time to extend grace and forgiveness and to release people from unreasonable expectations. Or maybe right now you're dissatisfied or disillusioned in your spiritual life, and it's leading to some doubt maybe in your relationship with God. Maybe adjusting your expectations for what he is responsible for in your life. Maybe opening yourself up to the better things that God has for you. Maybe that's your next step. Whatever it is this morning, let's say yes to Jesus and respond the way that he would have us respond this morning.